Hi everyone, I'm Michael Kellett. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Susan. I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and hearing what I talk about here. I think it's important for all Americans to talk about the entire country. I'm focusing on New England at the moment mostly, but what I'm going to talk about is really national and international in importance. And that's new national parks. Oh, there we go. Okay. People who have spent a lot of time working on national park issues, following national parks, reading about them, know about the connection of Frederick Law Olmsted, who really kind of laid the groundwork for what became national parks. Most people don't know much about the history, and he, of course, worked for many years on parks all over the country, but that obviously had an impact on him building his philosophy and coming to the conclusions he did. By the time he made this, did this talk in California on Yosemite Valley, mainly Yosemite Valley, he had a really good idea of what he was thinking of in terms of public parks. And so he talked about, in those days, the main reason for parks was seen as health and spirit and outdoor recreation and so forth, all of which are good things, but in those days, of course, the science of ecology was barely even being thought about, and the Earth had a lot fewer people. We didn't have climate change, at least as far as people knew. So that was the major concern that he was trying to address, which of course is a really important one to this day. Oops. But he had this opportunity. He was asked to provide a vision for what to do with Yosemite Valley. The state of California was looking at possible futures for the valley, and he said this is a great opportunity for us to set this aside for the public. And it's interesting that he talked about how most things that are being enjoyed are by rich people and elites and so forth. So it's interesting that that was an issue then, it's still an issue now. And he was directly trying to address that by having these public places where anybody could go, which was a really radical idea in those days. And in fact, when Yellowstone National Park was created, the world's first national park in 1872, they basically used some of the language he had written earlier about Yosemite and so forth. So really, it's his vision that they used as an overlay for Yellowstone National Park. So the enabling legislation for Yellowstone, again, they'd never had anything like this, so they invented this based a lot on his language. Then when they created additional parks, they basically used that language as the basis for the outline of what the new parks will be and the whole national park system. Since then, and Yellowstone is the epitome of this. So here's a map of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as it's called. And you can see Yellowstone is the big square there. There's Grand Teton National Park. But all the green around there is national forest land, mostly. There's some Bureau of Land Management land that's kind of in brown, which is appropriate. And, but this area now, because this big area, 2.2 million acres, was protected, not for wildlife and biodiversity or whatever, but because it's so big, it's become one of the most important biodiversity core areas in the world, really, and it's the heart of this large area of public land. And so today, here we have a whole set of things all at once that Olmsted could barely have imagined, but the idea of the national parks that he helped to create is a really good fit for addressing these problems. Climate change, loss of biodiversity and extinction of species, and threats to public health and well-being, and COVID has just doubled down on on that problem, of course. So if you read the headlines, you're seeing these things all the time. So here's one headline: keeping mature forests intact is key to the climate fight. And we now know that protecting forests is vital to keep carbon in the trees and in the soil and keep it out of the atmosphere where it fuels global warming. The problem is most of the forests in the U.S. are still open to logging and drilling and mining and development. They're not protected, and things are getting worse. Here's as you see right there, there's a clear cut in White Mountain National Forest, which we all own. It's in New Hampshire. That's what they're doing to White Mountain National Forest. I don't call that protected, other than there's not a Walmart parking lot being built there. Another headline is the million species at risk of extinction, UN reports. So this is not some left-wing radical crazy thing. The UN recognizes that because of destruction of habitat, only 14% of US lands are well protected, not being clear-cut, et cetera. But the scientists are saying we need 30% of the US to be protected by 2030, and 50% of the planet by 2050, and we've got about 14% in the US. And only 3% of New England meets those protection standards. 0% of Connecticut, there's some...
51%.
Depends on how you look at it. But anyway, it's a very teeny percentage, let's say that. And what you see there in that photo, that's an oil field. That's a kind of drilling. That's public land. That's Bureau of Land Management land in Wyoming. That's your land, our land, and that's what's happening. And you can guarantee that's not good for wildlife and biodiversity. And then especially COVID has made this worse, but the whole thing of national parks and public lands being loved to death is a growing problem. And the national park system had about 300 and some odd million visitors last year, which is almost the entire equivalent to the population of the entire United States in 1 year going to the national parks. But 90% of the national park acreage is west of the Great Plains in Alaska. And most large cities do not have any large national park nearby, so people have to go a long way to go to a national park. Most people do. And we've hardly created any new parks since the 1990s, so we're not dealing with this problem. So there's one solution that could help address all three of these problems, and that's to expand our national park system. And it's interesting, there's this concept of multi-solving now to talk about climate change and other problems where you do have one solution and it's a solution to multiple things at the same time. Well, national parks are a solution to all three of those problems. And that's because national parks, the National Park System and the language that was used in this original Organic Act in 1916 when the National Park Service was created was based, part of it was literally lifted from Olmsted and it was a riff on his ideas and concepts. And it's fairly simple though, actually. It just basically says you conserve it, so which mainly you're drawing a line around it and saying this is going to be a park. You're preserving it for the public's enjoyment. So it's not locked up away from people, so you can't go in there. This is meant to be enjoyed by the public, and it's for the people. But these lands have to be kept unimpaired for future generations, which means we're not supposed to do anything that degrades and damages the ecosystem, which is really the key. This is the key to national parks. There's nothing other than wilderness areas, and they don't have a mandate for public. They allow, people are allowed in wilderness areas, but that's not a primary reason we have wilderness areas. National parks, that is a primary reason we have national parks, to invite people to go out and enjoy nature and historic areas. And so national parks are the only federal land that has this mandate, and basically there are no state lands to any great extent that have this mandate either. So what would national parks do for climate? So national parks don't allow logging, so the trees old growth trees would stand, and younger trees would be allowed to grow back and absorb and store carbon. There are other, national parks can also encompass grasslands, wetlands, waters, which are also really important for carbon storage and sequestration. And natural ecosystems have been found to be more resilient. So you think about sea level rise, mangroves along the coast help to buffer waves and hurricanes with sea level rise. So that's sometimes called natural infrastructure, but though national parks serve as that. For biodiversity, national parks allow nature to take her course without us interfering and manipulating and degrading. So we basically allow these systems to operate on their own. A lot of national parks, especially in the east, though, have been created on lands that were degraded before. So, in fact, for example, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is our most visited national park, which is in North Carolina and Tennessee, most of that was clear-cut and then turned into farmland. It wasn't very good farmland, but it was basically not a natural ecosystem. When the park was created and they bought the land from the people who lived there, and a lot of it was owned by big timber companies who were just cutting it down too. So they saved some old growth that was left, and they allowed the rest of the forest to grow back. And if you've been there, most people would not know that this is not a natural forest. It's been there for ever without being manipulated or cut. And because the ecosystem there is so rich and fertile that the forests grow like crazy there. So if we expanded national parks, potential, just the ones we have looked at as potential expansions, we could increase the amount of land protected in the US to about 20% from 14%. It's still not 30%, but it's a big jump in the right direction. And for people, of course, national parks, what's one of their mandates is to be open for people to enjoy, which of course, with the number of parks we have, it's a problem sometimes because there are too many people and too few parks. But if you expand the park system, it could relieve pressure on the existing parks, because a lot of the current parks, they're all great, but there are a lot of places that are not national parks that are really amazing. And people, if they were national parks, a lot of people would go to these places who aren't going there now, and that means some of them would say, oh, I've seen Old Faithful in Yellowstone, I'm not going to go back there again, I'm going to go to another park, which I haven't been to. We can bring national parks to people in the Northeast, in the Midwest, and the Southeast. East of the Rockies, there are very few national parks. And if you want to go to a major, there are a lot of historic areas, which are great, and small parks, but that's not the same as going to a Yellowstone or Yosemite or a large park like that. That's why Great Smoky Mountains is so crowded all the time, because it's one of the only parks in the Northeast, in the East, and in the Northeast we have Acadia National Park. That's the only one in the entire Northeast, and it's small and it's way up in Maine, so most people, it's not very accessible to them, but it's still crowded. The other thing is if people don't have to travel as far to go to parks, they're not spewing out as much greenhouse gas, and that's now, of course, becoming it was always the case, but people are more and more aware of that now and trying to reduce the amount of plane flights they take and the amount of long trips they're driving. And of course, then fuel is getting more expensive. So if you have a park pretty close, in fact, some national parks could, of the proposed ones, you could have public transportation to go there, which would be even better. And then, of course, parks provide all the things that, clean air, water, soil protection that intact ecosystems provide, but they're not in danger of being degraded in the future by development. So where could we create these national parks if we expand the national park system? So here are existing parks, and I don't expect you to read it, but actually the name of each of these is shown there, but you can see in the east they're also small, almost all of them, that you don't even see the park, you just see the name. You can see, there's Blue Ridge Parkway is that green strip that you see in the middle of, along the east there, and Everglades you can see way down in Florida at the very tip. But other than that, in the east, and Great Smoky Mountains even doesn't look very big. So almost all these big parks are in the west. There's Alaska, that's a huge number of the parks. But if you look at where existing public lands are, then you got a lot more to work with. So here's the green is national forests. The dark green, the light green is national parks. The yellow is Bureau of Land Management lands, and most of you probably aren't even very familiar with them, but that's actually the largest land holding in the United States is Bureau of Land Management. Most of those lands are not developed, although they are being degraded and they have livestock raising and other stuff, so they're not permanently well protected. But if you start looking at even existing public lands, then you've got a lot of opportunities to upgrade their protection, like the White Mountains, which I showed you. And then if you want to have national parks all across the country, then you have to get even more imaginative. You have to start piecing together smaller pieces that are intact, either were bought by the state or by land trusts, and hook those to existing public lands and so forth. But if you start doing that, you can actually, there's a lot to work with in the east. So we have put together a proposal for 100 new national parks or expanded national parks. A few of them are expansion. And every single state in the country would have at least one national park, which is not the case now. And this is not just small historic areas, this is real national parks that are maybe not as large as Yellowstone, but pretty good size, large enough to offer all these different benefits that the national parks offer. So here's an example just in New England. I won't go into great detail, but here's a map of showing New England. We proposed a Maine Woods National Park 20 years ago, and a portion has now been turned into Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. It was donated by a philanthropist, and President Obama designated it. It's under the National Park Service, so it's basically like a mini national park. It's not nearly as large as what we proposed, but that's how most parks get started, piece by piece. Another possibility is down east, Maine. There's pieces of state land and land trust lands, but this is the Bold Coast, the Cutler Coast, Cobscook Bay, if anyone's been way down east. And it's pretty much all undeveloped, but it's not protected, most of it. It's really biodiverse, it's really beautiful, it's really important. It's going to get ruined eventually by vacation homes and resorts and stuff. White Mountain, as I mentioned, the White Mountain National Forest is the largest tract of public land in New England. That should be turned into a national park and protected. We should get rid of logging. We should get rid of all the development kind of stuff they're doing. Same with the Green Mountain National Forest is a little bit smaller. It's in Vermont. but it's also being logged and degraded, and that should be a national park. And then in Massachusetts, the Quabbin Reservoir, anyone who's ever been there, this is the largest tract of public land in southern New England. So it's big. It's about 70,000 acres, all public ownership, but they're logging in the watershed supposedly to help water quality, which is, of course, the opposite of what anybody with any common sense would believe is good for water quality. Berkshire, you could create a national park that's multiple units tied together under one management, and that includes western Massachusetts and also far northwest Connecticut in the Housatonic Valley area. And then you use those as sort of core areas to link and add to, and that's been done in a lot. That's how Acadia, in a small way, that's exactly what Acadia is, because Acadia National Park is all donated land by people who bought the land privately and donated it to the public. It started out as 8,000 acres of a guy who generously donated them to the public. So that's how in the East, we can create national parks. Those lands are not protected now very well. Most of them are open to logging and potentially solar, clear cutting of forests for solar development, other not so good ideas. Cape Cod is a national seashore, if anyone's been there, but it's a small footprint of public land. And it's really great, but actually there are state lands, there are land trust lands scattered around in town lands scattered around in the Cape, and they could be brought together in sort of a cooperative national park, as well as Stellwagen Bank, which is offshore, which is huge, but which is not fully protected. There are right whales, all kinds of marine life. One of the things about the 30 by 30 idea of 30% is that also we're supposed to be protecting 30% of marine areas, and we aren't even close to that either. There's only one large marine protected area in the US, and it's fully protected, and it's in northwest of Hawaii. It's a huge area, it's great, but it's only one large area, and so this would be partly land and partly sea. And then Pachog Pawcatuck, which nobody has talked about as a national park, but actually Nature Conservancy has looked at this area, which is basically straddling the border of Rhode Island and Connecticut. And this is the largest chunk of relatively intact, undeveloped forest. It's not like Yellowstone, totally undeveloped, but it's pretty much intact between New York City and Boston along the East Coast. And it's near millions of people, but it's not, the state lands are not a lot of it is state owned, but it's not well protected. They're doing logging, they're doing all kinds of manipulation, supposedly to help wildlife, which is totally bogus. And so that could be a 60, 70,000 acre national park, tying together individual pieces. And also that can help to direct people who want to protect land, private individuals, to say, hey, you can help to connect pieces of a national park together by buying this land and donating it, which is what happens at Acadia, for example. So criteria for park, how do we decide what deserves to be a park, what doesn't deserve? In the old days, they used to, the criteria were, it's got to be a huge mountain, it's got to be a huge canyon, it's got to be spectacular, it's got to be one of a kind, it's got to be, bowl you over, incredible. But that's really just totally a cultural thing and one person's idea, or some people's idea of what makes something really special. But that has been shifting actually for quite a while. For example, think of the Everglades. That's not a big mountain, it's not a big canyon, it's not really spectacular visually unless you start appreciating that it's this huge expanse of wild, and you got these birds and wildlife. And so we're changing our views of what is special and what deserves protection. So And with climate change, that wasn't even in the mix of thinking about park designation even a few years ago. So we can create national parks that will protect huge amounts of carbon. For example, the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, which is on our list, 17 million acres. So that's about 6 times the size of Connecticut, roughly. That's being logged. They're logging old growth forests. They're doing all kinds of damage. That should be a national park. It's crazy that that's a national forest. That has about 40% of the carbon in all of the national forests in the United States, in that one forest. So talk about carbon storage. On the other hand, forests in the Northeast in New England actually are very carbon dense. Even though they've been cut over and they're not old growth, they actually store a lot of carbon even now. And if we create parks and allow them to grow back, they're going to store more and more and more in the future. Also, we know that climate change is shifting the climate north, the warm climate north, and so wildlife are tending to shift north and up hills and mountains. So if you have a little blob of a national park, where are the wildlife going to go when climate changes? If you're building condos all around and it's hemmed in, you got to have larger areas, connected areas. We can do that if we plan national parks well. National infrastructure, I mentioned that floods and so forth are mitigated by natural areas like national parks. Biodiversity, again, I mentioned if you have large areas that are protected, they can have a wide variety of ecosystems and habitats that allows wildlife to move around. If weather changes, if there's a storm, if there's a hurricane, it still allows enough habitat for wildlife to survive. And it's pretty well known which areas are super diverse and super important for endangered species and so forth. So we can target those areas. That's one of the criteria that we used in identifying these areas. And of course, as I mentioned, large blocks. So wherever you have an opportunity to block together big chunks of land and water, that's really critical for all these other reasons. And then public health and well-being. Giving people, the craziest idea is to try to limit people's access to public lands. I don't blame park people from doing reservations and stuff, but that's not a good thing. It's really not good, and it's not good to go to a place and have to have huge crowds and worry about trails getting beaten to death and so forth. Well, what we're proposing is tripling the size of the national park system. That all of a sudden opens, and most of the places we're talking about are not heavily used now. Some of them are, but most of them are not. And the Park Service is really good. Despite 300 million people visiting our parks, if you go to these national parks, they're not obviously destroyed. They're not destroyed. Sure, if you go to a really heavily used trail, sometimes they're eroded or whatever, but you still got wolves in Yellowstone, except when they go out of Yellowstone, they get shot, which is why we need to expand Yellowstone. But the parks are not being destroyed by all these people, but it's still unpleasant, it's not good, it's not a good visitor experience. Why are we crowding all these people in not enough parks when we got 100 areas that we could create as new parks and near people? So people, especially people in large cities, where do you go? I'm from Detroit originally. The closest national park to Detroit is Point Pelee in Canada. So that's where my dad would take us when we wanted to go bird watching, or we'd go to Canada. I mean, that's nuts. On the other hand, there are some places, even in the Midwest, there's some places where you can start to patch together recovery parks. And then, of course, there is an urgency here, because when you start looking at these areas, they're all being trashed. They're all being logged, they're in danger of development, they're being drilled, they're mined. So we need to protect, really focus on the areas that are most threatened, and really try to get them protected soon. Also, as I mentioned, I showed you that map, there's a huge amount of land. A third of the US is federal public land. 1/3. Now, there's not very much in the east, but and then if you put state and local public land, it's another 10%. So 40% of the US is some kind of public land, but only 14% of the US is really protected. And then the rest is being misused and exploited. The other thing that's good about national parks, when you create a park, when they created parks long ago, they could just do whatever they wanted. Now you're talking about an overlay over lands where there's existing use for the most part. So for example, in Maine, hunting is a really big deal. They've been doing it for years. It's a family tradition. When we proposed the Maine Woods National Park, we didn't propose just a park where you can't hunt. Like Yellowstone, you cannot hunt. But in a national preserve, which is basically a national park that allows flexibility, you can hunt. You can allow other uses. Otherwise, it's protected just like a park. And the hunting is well regulated and whatever, so you don't have to worry about wolves being killed because they wouldn't allow that sort of thing, but they would allow deer and whatever. So national parks wilderness is less flexible because it doesn't allow trails, or at least building new trails or anything, doesn't allow road use or whatever. So although they offer really good protection, also wilderness areas have to be where there's no road. And there's hardly any place in the east where you can designate wilderness because almost all of the east has some kind of roads. Now, when you create a national park, you can get rid of roads, which is what has happened where an existing, let's say a national forest that has all these logging roads, you can close the roads, turn them into to trails, or let them totally recover. And then there are a number of areas across the country where there are groups already talking about creating national parks. Well, those groups really need help, and what we need to do is join together in a coalition to create more parks. And I'll try to finish up here quickly. The parks are created by either the Congress passes legislation, or the president can create a national monument, which is basically like a national park if it's under the Park Service. Now, right now, things are not exactly going great in terms of legislation moving, but these things take a long time. It takes years to build a campaign and build support. So now is the time to be building for the next opportunity. And people ask, well, geez, aren't they controversial? What about, loggers and miners and all these interested developers? Aren't they going to stop these parks from happening? And the answer is they've tried to do this since the very beginning. I won't read all of these, but you can see 1872, they were belly aching that Bozeman, Montana was going to be a ghost town if Yellowstone National Park was created. Now it's growing so fast they have to have zoning in place to prevent it from being ruined by development. Every single national park just about had just incredible opposition from the usual cast of characters, and the complaints are almost exactly the same as they are now. When I hear the people complaining about, oh, we don't want this park for blah, blah, I'm going, oh yeah, I've heard that 1,000 times. It's a 100-year-old, 150-year-old argument. And here's another one, faddists and extremists and blah, blah, blah. And these are all parks that, of course, people love and were created and have existed, and you couldn't take these away. For example, Grand Canyon, if you look at the Arizona license plate, it's the Grand Canyon State. And it's because it's a huge tourism draw. You couldn't take it away if you tried. And then the last one here is, I mentioned Katahdin National Monument in Maine, and the governor, former governor, fortunately, wanted Trump to get rid of it, and then he wanted him to open it to logging. And but as soon as that monument was created, and the reason he was complaining to Trump is because the same arguments were being made against a national park and a monument in Maine. But as soon as it happened, all of a sudden, property values started going up in Millinocket, where you could buy a house for like $40,000. where all the businesses were closing and so forth, all of a sudden things were starting to perk up. And people went there who lived in the area and they said, wow, this is nice. I like this. What's the, And so basically opposition disappeared very quickly. And so here he was just basically was belly aching because he was mad that it got created and he didn't want it. And he basically got nowhere. And one reason Trump didn't do anything is because he talked to the members of Congress in Maine, who partly Republicans, who said, no, don't get rid of it. People like this monument. So when you hear about opposition, yeah, sure, there are legitimate concerns. You can have development in a town. It affects the economy and so forth. That's legitimate, but most of the complaints are really not constructive. They're just bad faith complaints. And the opposite is true. National parks are one of the most popular things in the U.S. government. And the Pew Center does, every so often does public opinion surveys. And next to the U.S. Postal Service, the National Park Service is consistently the the second-rated U.S. agency in government. So anyway, the point is what's needed is groups need to get together, look at places, study, look at options, start organizing, start talking to each other, and you end up having to have legislation in getting the president on your side. And it takes time to do this. So we need to start now if we're going to get new parks. And I think we can create a bunch of new parks all across the country if we all work together. So anyway, and I end with Edward O. Wilson, a conservation biologist who died recently, who basically said, this is really a bad time, but if we can just get through this and make some good decisions now, people in the future are going to be better off. And so now's the time to do it. So, thanks. I don't know if we have time for questions.
Yeah, I'm sure we have time for a few questions, and I just want to ask you to repeat the question.
Okay, yeah. Any questions? Yes.
So there's one of the strategies is to have all these layers of different, like there's the County Refuge and the state land trusts and the trustees of the reservation and et cetera, right? And then all of those have different governance structures. And, in some respects, that's a kind of checks and balances from the centralization of a national park system, which would be beholden to whatever administration is in Washington, right? There could be that. So what's your take on all the alternatives, like especially the National Fish and Wildlife Refuge system and then the trustees of the reservation, two very different, but presumably related to conservation.
Did people hear that? Should I repeat it?
Yeah, I might want to repeat it.
So what about other options? How do you put that national parks in the perspective of the other options available? And those are there's all those options you mentioned, national wildlife refuges, private land trusts, et cetera, state lands, those are all fine. There's nothing wrong with those, but they don't do the same thing as a national park. National wildlife refuges, even though they're supposed to be refuges, almost all of them allow hunting. And whether or not you're for hunting, I think it's weird to be hunting in a refuge. And what it does is it creates a conflict, and I think there could be places where it's appropriate, but what they've done is basically made that hunting hunters their constituents. And so what they do is they manage for more game species, like more deer and more ducks and more woodcock. And pretty soon, that's really what their driving force is. When hunters and fishermen ought to be, along with everyone else, ought to be the legitimate potential users of different places. And national parks actually allow fishing. National preserves, as I mentioned, allow hunting. So you can provide for those things, but National Park Service, rather than being driven by those things, it's driven by protection first and various uses second. The other thing is that they actually, on Trustees of Reservation, it's a private nonprofit, and although they've done great work for over a century, that's not the same as public land. Public land is in statute. There's a law that actually designates that area as protected forever, and that has held up really well. For example, under Trump, they tried their best to really undermine national parks. And they did do some not so good things, but the reality is they weren't able to do much of what they wanted to do, because as soon as they started messing around, they had 300 million people who love national parks who said, wait a minute, wait. For example, they were going to do drilling outside of Arches in Canyonlands National Park in Utah. And that got scotched because the public, that's in Utah, which is not ultra left wing. But people said, no way, not even near a national park. So whereas and then the other thing is most of these other ones, national wildlife refuges can be really big, like in Alaska. And some of the western ones are protected well and don't do logging and stuff like we do in the east. But national parks most state lands are not anywhere close in terms of protection to the size of a national park. Now Michigan has like 3.7 million acres of state land, which is being hammered by logging and drilling. If some of those were protected as a national park, you would have some really large areas. So it's not either or, but if you want maximum protection, you want public access and use, and you want natural wildlife habitat, national parks are the best single way to do that.
Just to follow up, why can't, like, the people of, say, the state of Connecticut or wherever really impress upon their state governments that they don't want that on state lands? Because I don't think a lot of people know that, about management. Because there are a lot of management questions in using for a small land trust. And it seems like most people just don't know to get engaged for those reasons.
So the question is, can't people get engaged, and shouldn't they get engaged, and do they know what's going on state lands? And my answer is no, they don't, and most people are not engaged. And in Massachusetts, we have state legislation that would stop logging on state lands, on most state lands, and protect them sort of like national parks, really. And a lot of people, number one, most people don't know, just like you mentioned, that they are logging on state lands, just like Connecticut is hammering state forests with logging. And Rhode Island as well on state lands. So, but people don't know that. So when they find out, they say, what can I do? It's not simple, but there's legislation that we have. You can organize comments, letter writing to the agency. It helps. It doesn't usually take care of the problem. I think, as you mentioned, the government, the governor and the legislature are really the best way to permanently fix that. Yes?
I have a question sort of related to that, which is, the backyard of like where I live is the Southwest State Forest. So like what my parents would always tell me is like, oh, we don't have to worry about anything happening there because that's state property. And then all of a sudden they started logging it, and that was really freaky. And so my question really is there any place where like the state or someone has to report those activities? Like, I'm sure it might be very deep somewhere, but does that have to be made public to the people in like a consistent way?
Yeah, well, so what's the public process for logging on state land is basically the question. And the reality is, in most cases, there's not much of a public process. And for example, in Massachusetts, they do issue a plan. Most people don't know that it exists, but you can comment on it, but then they ignore the comments. So same with national forests. They have a process. You can comment, you can read, you can see the map of what they're going to do, and they say, so give us your comments. And then they say, thank you, and see you later, and they do exactly what they were going to do. I mean, a lot of government agencies do that kind of thing. But in this case, of course, you lose a bunch of trees. So the reality is the only way to change it, I think, is to change the mission. The mission right now is multiple use, which means you can do anything and everything. And, you know, they can't build a Walmart, they can't nuke it, but they can do a lot of damage, and it's totally legal under the law, because the laws are old. The laws for these state lands they've been around for, you know, decades. That was back in the days when climate change, biodiversity, whatever, people weren't even thinking about that. Yes.
One of the things I wonder about, the environment we live in, there's wood everywhere. Look up at the ceiling, there's wood. We're all surrounded by wood all the time. So the idea that like we need more wood for people to, you know, live in seems like something that's hard to argue with. How do you talk about that in terms of getting inside people's heads to come along around to your point of view?
So the question is, we all use wood, we need wood. How do you respond to that when you talk about protecting forests from being logged? And the response is, this is a different world today. We've got climate change. We know that the world's forests are unsustainably being logged. And U.S. forests are unsustainable, although they tell us otherwise, we're logging them like crazy. And demand for wood products and paper goes up and up and up and up. Well, where's the end? There's no end to that. So we can't be demand driven. We have to be supply driven. We need to say, what do we need to protect? And then how are we going to work around it? That's what we need to be doing. We need to say, well, you know, gee, we can't tear that house down and build a giant replacement house. Maybe we need to keep that house and fix it up, or we need to stop wasting so much paper and wood. Almost all wood is not recycled. It ends up being burned or landfill. When you tear down a house, most of the wood never gets reused. It never gets recycled. It goes in a landfill or it's burned, and it ends up in the carbon ends up in the atmosphere. So there's no sense right now that wood needs to be considered valuable and something we steward and use as a precious thing. Now it's cheap, it's easy. Even, you know, wood has gone up in price, but it's still really cheap. That's why we build all our houses out of wood. They use huge amounts of wood. And the other thing is, although the claim is that, well, you know, carbon ends up in wood and it's stored in that wood. Well, yeah, as long as the wood remains intact, but the average house age is about 50 years. So much for that. And when you cut down a tree, turn it into 2x4s, or you turn it into furniture or whatever, about 20 to 40% of that wood ends up in furniture or the house. The rest is bark, leaves, twigs, knot holes, whatever. And most of that gets burned, or it gets ground up and it's turned into mulch, which is fine for a couple of years, and then it's gone into the atmosphere. So we need, and that doesn't even get into biodiversity, which we know that we've cut down almost all our old growth forests. And the way we're doing it now, there are never going to be much of any old growth forests again, because we don't allow the forest to recover. We keep cutting and cutting and cutting. It's like a cornfield. So we need to flip it on its head and say it's demand. You know, nobody thinks that we should have endless demand for gold or anything else. But we've been sold this thing that wood is this renewable, endless resource, and look what's happened with fish in the ocean with this mentality of demand driven. It's the same thing. Basically, well, there's more demand for fish. What are we going to do? We're just going to have to overfish. And they're gone. Now what? And so we have to just say, look, we know what we need for biodiversity, for climate change, for people. Here we're cutting down forests when people don't have a place to go to get it for their health and for their well-being or whatever. That's crazy. So we need to just refuse to accept that approach, that demand approach, and say, let's talk about protection first. And then what's left over, we can start talking about how we use it. Yes?
So two questions. One is, while the national parks are held in public trust and they're open to anybody, we know that the people who use them are not as diverse as our country at large. The people who use the parks are much older and whiter. This is a demographically much narrower group than the 300 plus million people in our country. So I guess my question is about that and what we see as the solutions. I mean, you talked about building parks closer to major urban centers, and that's certainly important. That seems like only part of the answer of increasing the diversity of the use of our parks. And the other question I had is just how would you address this problem of too many people using some of the parks, the most popular of the parks, and kind of loving them to death? And, you know, some of the parks have reservation systems and other ways of managing the crowd. How do you see in the long term what's the solution to that particular problem?
So the two questions. One is, what about diversity in national parks? How do we increase diversity? And also, how do we avoid overuse and loving the parks to death? And regarding diversity, there's no question that that's a problem. Part of it is that in the 100 years ago, 80 years ago, especially in certain parts of the country, there were discriminatory practices and laws. They were not mostly driven by the Park Service. The Park Service went along with the states and local governments' preference. And in fact, now they still do that kind of thing. They go along with things that are not so good because the state demands it. So it happened, but it was not driven from the National Park Service. And now the National Park Service is really recognizing they have to go push the other way to try to make up for years of that problem getting entrenched. And the other thing is, if my dad, when I was a kid, took us out hiking in the parks, we went to national parks or whatever. A lot of kids, especially kids living in social justice, environmental justice communities that don't have a lot of money or living in a dense urban area, they don't have that option. They're not used to, that's not a normal thing for them. So I think part of it is a sort of a, repeat of what, not even recognizing what's out there, what the possibilities are, not feeling comfortable, maybe not feeling invited. So, but I think that's changing. For example, there's a proposal for a national park a couple national parks near Los Angeles, and actually they created a national monument, they converted a national forest into a national monument, and which is not a national park. It's not the same. It's not as good, but it's better. And the main reason was Latino communities said, we've got all these people in LA here, and we've got these national forest lands. They're mismanaged. They're not taking care of them. They can't take care of the crowds that come. They're not good at recreation. That's the other problem, is these other agencies are not good at recreation. So they don't manage the people very well when they do come. And so now this national monument, there are actually bus lines that can take you to go there and so forth. So I think we need to really take it seriously, and it's partly opening society up to encourage people to come, and we got a lot more work to do, but I think that's very possible. And in fact, if you look at public opinion surveys, Black people, Latinos, Asian Americans actually value environmental protection more than white people do. That's the progression going down. So it's not that they don't care about any of this stuff, which is an old chestnut that I think they used to say in the old days, oh, well, those people don't want to go. That's not it, of course. So if we create some big new parks near big cities, have programs to, and have public transportation, have encourage people, I think we're going to see a big change in a good way. So but if you got to go to Yellowstone, you got to fly to Yellowstone from Connecticut if you're ever going to go see a big national park. How many people can do that? I can't, I've been there, but I can't afford to go there every year. And, a lot of people can never afford to go there. So the answer to the loving the parks to death is intertwined with that, because if we create more parks and they're more accessible to people nearby, not as many people will fly out to Yellowstone, which is, there'll still be plenty of people who go there, but it won't be as many people. So.
One more question, awesome.
I was wondering if, just in sort of like in relation to that question, I was wondering if maybe you could speak more to, like, if there are, because I don't even know if there is any plans for something like this, but sort of the plans to work together with like tribal nations who might be close to these lands, may have historically been on these lands, what have you, and that sort of also being a way, like wondering if there's a way to also affirm tribal sovereignty while accomplishing this goal at the same time in a complementary way, if that makes sense. And by extension, then also sort of like increasing the diversity of people who are benefiting from the positive impact of the fund.
So the question is regarding tribal lands and how that interrelates with parks. And there's a lot more talk about that now, and that's good. And in the east, there's not as much overlap because we have very few parks. But for example, the Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota, there's right now, it overlaps with with the reservation, but the land, they never really fleshed out exactly where the reservation was. It was sort of vaguely laid out. So now Congress passed a law that said that there's going to be some kind of an agreement where they're going to work this out and figure it out and solidify the boundaries. But also they're trying to work hand in hand to manage the forest to benefit everybody. Now the problem is it's a national forest, so they're doing logging, which is not good. And in fact, the tribe has written to them saying they think they're logging too much. So I think people have probably heard of Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, which is not a national park area, it should be, but that was actually created, a lot of the impetus was from tribal people living near, in that area who had a tie to those lands. And so now they've worked out a cooperative sort of management agreement to bring them in as active part of the planning and management of the area. So I think we'll probably see more, and the National Park Service has talked about doing more of that too, so.
Great, thank you. I'll just make one last comment. There is very detailed information on the proposed park areas in New England on the table if you want to check that out. And I also want to mention that the National Park Service has a program where 4th graders and their families get to go to national parks for free. So I didn't find this out until after I was in 4th grade or after my own children were in 4th grade. But if you know any kids who are approaching 4th grade, it's a great program that makes all of our national parks available. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.